My name is Maisie Wright, and I'm a 27-year-old sergeant in the U.S. Army Special Forces. I've survived ambushes in Afghanistan and covert operations in places you've never even heard of. But when I came home to care for my sick mother, I never imagined that home could be more dangerous than a war zone. I can still feel the cold steel of the blade tearing through my flesh. Not once, but 8 times. As my blood pooled on the filthy floor, I didn't see an enemy. I saw the familiar face of my stepbrother, Ethan. His eyes lit with hatred, and I heard my stepfather's voice in my head. His words from just hours before. "She doesn't respect us, son. Teach her a lesson." They thought those 8 wounds would silence me forever. But they didn't know that their every move had been recorded. And they had woken up something far more terrifying than a soldier. They had woken up an entire army. If you have ever been wronged by your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this is a story about finding your real family in the most unexpected of places, and about a justice so powerful it can heal any wound. Stepping out of the taxi in Charleston, the thick, humid air hit me like a heavy blanket, a familiar feeling I hadn't missed. The city's historic charm, with its cobblestone streets and iron-wrought balconies, felt like a world away from the dread coiling in my stomach. The house itself was the same small, single-story home, its pale yellow siding peeling near the gutters like sunburnt skin. But the moment I pushed open the groaning screen door, a stale, suffocating scent of old cigarettes and dampness confirmed this wasn't a homecoming. It was an infiltration. My stepfather, Gerald, was cemented in his worn-out armchair, the glow of a baseball game flickering across his impassive face. He glanced up over his reading glasses, his eyes holding no warmth, no recognition of the years I'd been away. "You're here," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. It was an observation, not a welcome, as if noting the arrival of an unwanted package. "Bag in the corner. Don't clutter the place." From the couch, a mocking laugh cut through the air. My stepbrother, Ethan, was sprawled out, a half-empty bottle of Budweiser dangling from his fingers, his posture a study in lazy contempt. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered, his eyes raking over my uniform pants and simple t-shirt. To them, my service wasn't a source of pride. It was a bizarre costume, a game I was playing. "Come home to play soldier, Maisie." My mother, Martha, then hurried from the kitchen, wiping her damp hands on a faded floral apron. "Maisie, honey, you're home." She wrapped her arms around me, but the hug was quick, frantic, her bones sharp beneath my hands. Her body was tense, and her eyes kept darting towards Gerald, a silent, reflexive check for his approval. She whispered, "Welcome home." But the words felt hollow, stripped of meaning. With Gerald's cold, dismissive stare on my back and the venom in Ethan's smirk, I knew with chilling certainty. I was in enemy territory. Later, the tension coiled itself around the dinner table, a silent 4th member of the family. The food my mother had spent the afternoon preparing sat on our plates, lukewarm and unappetizing. The mashed potatoes were lumpy and tasted of instant flakes, the green beans overcooked to a dull, sad gray. It was food made from obligation, not love. Gerald cleared his throat, the sound sharp and commanding, signaling the start of his training session. "So, what did they teach you in that army?" he began, not looking at me but at the wall behind me, as if I were a ghost he was forced to acknowledge. "Probably just to shoot guns and run around like a man. In this house, there are rules. Manners." He shoved a bowl of the mashed potatoes towards me, the aggressive slide of ceramic on wood a small act of violence. "Eat. Your mother cooked all afternoon. Don't be disrespectful." My training demanded a high-protein, low-carb diet for peak physical readiness. The thought of the heavy, starchy meal turned my stomach. "I'm not that hungry, thank you," I said, my voice carefully even, a practiced calm I used in the field. Ethan let out a bitter, explosive laugh. "Too good for home cooking now. Guess you're used to that fancy government chow." He took a large, sloppy bite, chewing with his mouth open, a deliberate display of vulgarity meant to provoke. I thought of the MREs I'd shared with my unit in the middle of nowhere, the simple, functional food tasting like a feast because of the camaraderie around me. I felt more family in those dusty, dangerous places than I did here, in this suffocatingly quiet dining room. I felt like a prisoner under interrogation. Every word, every bite I didn't take was scrutinized and weaponized. I wasn't their daughter or sister. I was a foreign entity, an unwelcome presence whose very existence needed to be controlled. The silence between their jabs was thick with years of unspoken resentment. I kept my head down, staring at a chip in my plate, my stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. This wasn't a meal, it was a punishment. After dinner, I retreated to my old bedroom, desperate for a pocket of peace, a space to just breathe. But that sanctuary had been violated. The room was barely recognizable. Ethan's dirty clothes were piled on the floor, emitting a sour smell, and empty beer cans littered my old dresser like fallen soldiers. A thick layer of dust covered everything. My personal space had been colonized. As I cleared a spot for my duffel bag, I noticed my nightstand drawer was slightly ajar. I pulled it open. My old journals, a few photos, they had all been rummaged through. A small framed picture of my biological father, the only one I owned, was lying face down. A cold, quiet fury, different from any combat rage I'd ever felt, rose in my chest. It was a violation that felt deeper than a physical blow. I walked back out to the living room, where the TV was blaring a loud, obnoxious sitcom. "Someone was in my room," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "In my things." Gerald didn't even look at me. "I was looking for a screwdriver," he said, his tone flat, unapologetic, the lie lazy and insulting. "This is my house. I can go into any damn room I want. You got a problem with that?" I stared at him, at the absolute, unshakable ownership in his voice. He wasn't just claiming the house, he was claiming me, my memories, my right to privacy. My training screamed at me to de-escalate, to observe, to not engage a superior force on unfavorable terms. Arguing was pointless. It would only give him the satisfaction of a fight. I turned and walked back to my room, but the flimsy door offered no protection. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the darkness, listening to their drunken argument through the wall, the words indistinct, but the anger clear. Any sense of safety was gone. I was a soldier trained for hostile environments, yet I'd never felt so utterly, helplessly exposed. The next afternoon, I found my mother on the back porch, staring into the overgrown yard where weeds choked the life out of her old rose bushes. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the incessant, droning buzz of cicadas. She looked so small, so fragile in her rocking chair. I pulled up another chair beside her, the plastic legs scraping against the concrete. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" I asked softly. She avoided my gaze, her eyes fixed on a distant, dying tree. "I'm fine, honey. Don't you worry." Her voice was thin, brittle as a dried leaf, but I had seen it. As she reached for her glass of iced tea, her sleeve had ridden up just enough. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming on her wrist, shaped unmistakably like fingerprints. My blood ran cold. I pointed to it gently. "What about this?" Her reaction was immediate, visceral panic. She yanked her sleeve down, her whole body tensing. "I fell," she whispered frantically, the words rushing out. "I just tripped. Maisie, please, don't ask any more. Just pretend you didn't see it, for God's sake." She finally looked at me, her eyes pleading with a terror that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "Your being here, it's already making Gerald agitated. Please, don't add fuel to the fire." Her plea was a knife in my gut. It wasn't a request for silence to protect herself. It was a command for my compliance to appease him. She was asking me to become invisible, to deny my own eyes, to maintain a toxic, fragile peace. Looking into her terrified eyes, I saw the devastating truth. She was a casualty of a war she had surrendered to long ago. She had made her choice, and in doing so, had left me alone on the battlefield. I sat there in the stifling quiet, the rhythmic creak of her rocking chair counting down the seconds to a disaster I could feel in my bones. This deep-rooted hatred, This quiet, suffocating cruelty. Where did it all begin? The question echoed in the oppressive darkness of my room, a ghost haunting the space between heartbeats. Where did it all begin? My mind, a trained instrument designed to analyze threats and trace their origins, didn't have to search far. It flew back through the years, landing with a sickening thud on one specific day. A day that was supposed to be about gratitude and family. A Thanksgiving, several years ago. I remember the feeling as I drove home that year. It was my first visit after completing the grueling Special Forces qualification course, the infamous Q course. The Green Beret, a symbol of honor earned through sweat, grit, and sheer willpower, was packed carefully in its case. I wore my Army service uniform, the dark blue jacket and crisp trousers pressed to perfection, the polished brass on my chest gleaming. Every inch of it felt like a testament to the person I had become. I was buzzing with a quiet, profound pride, a hope so bright it felt naive in retrospect. I finally had something to show them, something undeniable. I thought, this time, it will be different. This time, they'll see me. In the trunk of my car were gifts, bought with my first real paycheck as a sergeant. A beautiful, handcrafted leather wallet for Gerald. A soft cashmere scarf for my mother in her favorite shade of blue. A brand new PlayStation for Ethan, something he'd been complaining about wanting for months. They weren't just things, they were peace offerings. An attempt to bridge a gap I didn't fully understand but desperately wanted to close. I walked through that same front door, my posture straight, my heart full, hoping for a hug, for a simple, "I'm proud of you." What I received, however, was a meticulously set trap. The house was already crowded, the air was thick with the rich smell of roasting turkey and pumpkin spice, the roar of a football game blasting from the TV. I saw immediately that Ethan had invited a loud, boisterous group of his friends. He'd recently been fired from a warehouse job, something about an argument with his manager. And I could already see the familiar storm clouds of resentment brewing in his eyes. He saw my uniform, my success, as a personal insult to his failure. The ambush came just as everyone sat down to eat. The table was laden with food, a classic American Thanksgiving spread. Ethan, holding a beer, stood up and tapped his bottle with a fork, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey everyone, can I have your attention?" he announced, his voice slurring slightly. "I'd like to propose a toast." A few of his friends whooped and hollered. "To my stepsister Maisie, the family's very own hero." The word was drenched in sarcasm. The one who ran off to play soldier while I had to stay here and hold down the fort, taking care of everything. It was a blatant lie. He'd never held down anything but the couch. He launched into a fabricated story about how I was ungrateful, how I'd joined the army just to run away from my responsibilities. His friends, already several beers in, roared with laughter, hooting and egging him on. I sat there, frozen, the starched collar of my uniform suddenly feeling like it was choking me. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, some curious, some mocking. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but my throat was tight. That's when Gerald delivered the killing blow. He rose slowly from his chair at the head of the table, placing a heavy paternal hand on Ethan's shoulder in a clear gesture of alliance. "The boy's right," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter, silencing the room. He surveyed the guests, a self-satisfied patriarch. "Men build the house and women make the home. This one," he said, gesturing at me with a dismissive flick of his hand, "she'd rather go off and build who knows what." Then he turned his full attention to me, his eyes cold and filled with a deep, unsettling contempt, raked over my uniform, my very being. "You look at yourself in that thing," he spat, his voice low and dripping with scorn. "You're not quite a woman, and you're not quite a man. You're an embarrassment to this family." The words struck me with the force of a physical slap. The air was sucked out of the room. For a heart-stopping second, there was dead silence. And then, it started. A snicker from one of Ethan's friends, a quiet giggle from a cousin. Soon, the silence broke, and the room was filled with the quiet, cruel sound of muffled laughter. My face burned with a humiliation so hot and absolute it felt like it would melt my skin. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I just stood there, a statue in a uniform that suddenly felt like a fool's costume, my greatest achievement twisted into a public spectacle of shame. If you have ever had your biggest accomplishment, the thing you were most proud of, thrown back in your face by someone who was supposed to support you, hit that like button and comment, "I stand with Maisie," below. Let's show them what real support looks like. Later that night, long after the guests had left and the fake laughter had faded, I saw the gifts. They were in a corner by the back door, piled on top of a trash can, unopened. The pretty wrapping paper was still intact. The bows I'd so carefully tied still perfect. They hadn't even bothered. The final insult came when I walked into the kitchen. Ethan was there, showing off for my mother. He had taken my green beret, my sacred, hard-won green beret, and was wearing it on his head at a jaunty, idiotic angle, prancing around the kitchen like a clown. And my mother. She was just standing there, a weak, tired smile on her face, the way someone smiles at a misbehaving child they're too exhausted to correct. A surge of pure, cold rage went through me. I stalked across the room and snatched the beret from his head. It was more than a hat, it was a symbol of every mile I'd run, every obstacle I'd overcome, every brother in arms I had sworn to protect. He shoved me back, hard. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his face inches from mine, his breath sour with beer. "In this house, you're nothing." That memory, seared into my brain, played back in the darkness of my room now. It provided the answer to my question. The hatred wasn't new. It had been there all along, a festering wound deep in the foundation of this family. My return, my very presence, hadn't caused it. It had just given them a reason to finally let it bleed. The walls of that house were closing in. Every passing hour spent under Gerald's scrutinizing gaze and Ethan's simmering hostility was a fresh assault on my senses. The air itself felt thin, stripped of oxygen, replaced by a toxic blend of resentment and control. I had to get out. It wasn't a desire, it was a tactical necessity. My training had taught me to recognize an untenable position, and this house, my childhood home, had become just that. I grabbed my car keys, needing no other excuse than the preservation of my own sanity. I drove into the heart of historic Charleston, letting the familiar grid of streets guide me toward the sea. I parked and began to walk, my boots making a solid, reassuring sound on the uneven cobblestones of the old streets. The city was a living postcard, with its pastel-colored houses standing shoulder to shoulder, their ornate, iron-wrought balconies draped in cascades of bougainvillea. I breathed in deeply, pulling the salty, briny air from the harbor deep into my lungs, trying to flush out the stale, suffocating atmosphere of the house. The cry of the gulls and the distant horn of a ship were a symphony of freedom, a soundscape that began to slowly drown out the echo of their cutting words. On a whim, I stopped at a small corner store and bought a large sweet tea, the plastic cup sweating instantly in the humid afternoon. At home, Gerald had declared it unhealthy sugar water, another small, pointless restriction designed to exert control. But out here, under the wide-open Carolina sky, the icy, syrupy sweetness tasted like a small, private victory. It was a minor act of rebellion, a quiet declaration that I was still my own person. I savored each sip, feeling the cold liquid wash away some of the tension, granting me a precious, fleeting moment of peace. I found myself on King Street, the city's bustling main artery of shops and cafes. Tourists ambled along, their cameras clicking, their laughter light and carefree. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to just blend in, to be an anonymous face in the crowd, a soldier on leave enjoying a peaceful afternoon. But a soldier is never truly off-duty. My senses, honed by years of navigating hostile environments, are always scanning, assessing, listening. And as I passed a high-end boutique, my internal alarm system, the one that had kept me alive in dusty back alleys halfway across the world, suddenly blared a silent, urgent warning. My eyes snapped to a scene unfolding just ahead. An older man sat in a wheelchair, a faded U.S. Marine Corps cap perched on his head. His path was blocked by a trio of young men, their swagger fueled by cheap beer and an arrogant sense of entitlement. They were jeering at him, their laughter loud and ugly. One of them, the clear ringleader with a cruel smirk, leaned down and mocked the man's hat. Then, with a look of utter disdain, he spat on the ground, a glob of saliva landing inches from the veteran's wheel. I watched the crowd. People saw it. A woman pushing a stroller quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the pavement. A couple holding hands glanced over and then looked away, suddenly fascinated by a storefront window. Their silence, their collective decision to pretend nothing was happening, was a different kind of violence. Their apathy was as cruel as the spit on the ground. They were leaving a man, a Marine, to fight a battle alone. And that was something I could not let stand. I didn't hesitate for a single second. My body moved before my mind had time to weigh the consequences. I closed the distance in a few long, purposeful strides, my posture erect and solid. I didn't push or shove. I simply stepped between the man in the wheelchair and the threat, creating a human shield. I didn't say a word. I just looked at the ringleader, my gaze level and direct. My eyes, I've been told, go flat and cold in these moments. It's the look of someone who has seen far worse things than three drunken punks on a sunny afternoon. The ringleader's smirk faltered. My sudden, silent appearance had thrown him off his rhythm. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his dominance. "Move it, bitch!" he snarled, the insult lacking any real conviction. I kept my voice low, even, and stripped of all emotion. It was the same tone I used to give orders in the field, a tone that expected and received absolute compliance. "You have 3 seconds," I said, my eyes locked on his, "to get your friends out of here before I help you do it." There was no anger in my voice, no threat of a brawl. There was only a calm, unshakable certainty. He saw it in my eyes. He saw that I wasn't making a suggestion. I was stating a fact. A flicker of fear, then confusion, crossed his face. He and his friends exchanged uneasy glances. They had been looking for a soft target, an easy victim to amuse themselves with. They hadn't counted on this. The ringleader muttered a curse under his breath, gave me one last hateful glare, and then turned, herding his friends away. They disappeared back into the anonymous flow of the crowd. The silence they left behind was filled with the sounds of the city, suddenly loud again. The man in the wheelchair looked up at me, his aged, tired eyes shining with a profound and immediate gratitude. You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice a little shaky. I just shook my head. "It was the right thing to do, sir." He nodded, a small sad smile touching his lips. He pointed to the globe, eagle, and anchor on his cap. "Marines," he said simply. I tapped my chest. "Army," I replied. "Special Forces." An unspoken understanding passed between us, a bond forged in shared service that transcended branches, generations, and circumstance. We were two soldiers on a peaceful street, recognizing a kindred spirit. I walked with him to his van, which was parked nearby. As he prepared to use the ramp, he reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, soldier," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at his legs, then back up at me, his gaze fierce and proud. "They can take my legs, but they can't take our honor." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow, but in the best way possible. Honor. It was the very thing I felt was being stripped from me in that house, the thing Gerald and Ethan were trying to grind into dust with their words and their contempt. This stranger, this brother in arms, had just handed it back to me, whole and untarnished. He saw me, not as a freak or an embarrassment, but as a soldier, as an equal. I left him with a nod and a semper fi, a sign of respect he returned with a quiet, "Hoo-ah." I walked back to my car feeling stronger, taller, my purpose reaffirmed. His words had been a shield, reminding me of who I was and what I stood for. The feeling of empowerment carried me all the way home. But as I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. The shield. Robert's words had given me began to crack. Ethan was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. A half-empty bottle of whiskey was planted between his feet, and as he looked up at me, his eyes were cold and dark, promising a night that would be anything but peaceful. The moment I stepped back inside, the fragile shield of Honor Roberts' words had given me shattered into a million pieces. The house was frighteningly silent. Not peaceful, but the heavy, loaded silence of a battlefield after the shooting has stopped. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. In the dining room, the table was cleared. 3 plates, 3 sets of silverware, all washed, dried, and put away. A ghost of a meal that I was never a part of. I walked into the kitchen, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. On the stove, a pot of leftover mashed potatoes sat cold and congealed. A few scraps of roast beef were left on a plate, covered carelessly with plastic wrap. My punishment for the crime of defending a fellow veteran, for the crime of existing outside their control, was this: exclusion. The most ancient and cruelest of weapons. They had made me invisible, erased me from the evening, from the family. A gnawing hunger clawed at me, but it wasn't for food. It was the desperate, aching hunger of a soul that has been utterly and completely abandoned. Gerald emerged from the living room, his face a mask of cold indifference. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone was as chilling as the food on the stove. "You chose to wander the streets instead of having dinner with your family," he stated, as if reading from a verdict. "Now you can fend for yourself." Through the doorway, I could see my mother hovering, her silhouette a study in fear. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She had chosen her side, or rather, fear had chosen it for her. I turned without a word and went to my room, closing the door behind me. The silence in here was different. It was my own. But it offered no comfort. The emotional shrapnel from the evening's encounters began to do its work. The stress, the anger, the profound sense of betrayal, it all converged into a familiar, fiery pain in my stomach. It was a chronic condition, a physical scar from the high-stress deployments, a constant reminder of the price of my service. I doubled over on the edge of the bed, clenching my jaw against the sharp, stabbing cramps. I had no medicine here, not even a glass of warm water. I was alone, trapped in the dark, fighting a war on the inside. From the living room, I could hear the canned laughter of a sitcom on the TV, punctuated by the sounds of Gerald and Ethan arguing over a football game. Their casual, oblivious existence just a few feet away was a form of torture. Their indifference was more painful than any physical blow. I felt like a wounded soldier, bleeding out on the home front with no medic in sight. It was in that moment, at the absolute bottom of my despair, that I heard it. A soft, hesitant knock on my window. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I held my breath, listening. There it was again, gentle but insistent. I peeled myself off the bed, my stomach muscles screaming in protest, and moved to the window that faced the side yard. Peering through the blinds, I saw a familiar figure standing in the dim glow of the porch light. It was Robert Hayes. My mind raced. How did he find me? Why is he here? I opened the window just a crack, the cool night air a relief on my flushed face. He didn't try to explain much, but he didn't need to. His eyes, full of a quiet, profound understanding, said it all. "I got to thinking after I got home," he said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. "Figured your good deed today might have caused you some trouble on your end." He wasn't prying. He wasn't asking for details. He was just a soldier who knew that no good deed goes unpunished, especially in a war zone. And he had correctly identified my home as exactly that. In his hands, he held a large insulated thermos. "My wife, Sarah, she made some chicken soup," he explained, a small kind smile touching his lips. "She says there's nothing a hot bowl of chicken soup can't fix." He held it out to me. He didn't try to come in, didn't overstep. He simply offered his gift through the open window, a gesture of profound respect for my space, my privacy. I took the heavy thermos, my fingers numb. "Thank you," I managed to whisper, the words feeling inadequate. He just gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement, and then retreated back into the darkness, leaving me as quietly as he had arrived. I closed the window and leaned against the wall, the warmth of the thermos seeping into my hands. I unscrewed the lid, and a cloud of fragrant steam billowed out, filling the cold, sterile room with the rich, comforting aroma of chicken, vegetables, and herbs. It smelled of care. It smelled of home, a real home. I didn't bother with a bowl. I sat on the floor in the dark, the thermos cradled in my lap, and drank the soup directly from the lid. It was hot and rich and nourishing, and with each sip, I felt the tight, angry knot in my stomach begin to loosen. And then, the tears came. They slid down my cheeks, hot and silent, dripping into the soup. They weren't tears of self-pity or of pain. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude, tears of relief. For the first time since I'd come back, I felt warmth. It spread from my stomach through my entire body, a gentle heat that had nothing to do with the soup and everything to do with the gesture behind it. A man I had saved only a few hours ago had shown me more compassion, more simple human decency than my own family had in years. This bowl of soup wasn't just food, it was medicine. It was proof that I wasn't invisible. Someone saw me, and in that dark, lonely room, that small flicker of recognition was enough to reignite a hope I thought had been extinguished for good. In the days following the incident with Robert Hayes, a strange and unsettling calm fell over the house. It was the kind of quiet I knew from the field, the eerie silence that descends on a valley right before an ambush. Gerald and Ethan treated me with a new kind of weapon, complete and utter indifference. They didn't speak to me, didn't look at me. They simply moved around me as if I were a piece of furniture they'd grown tired of. And I found, to my own surprise, that their silence was a relief. It was far more bearable than the constant barrage of insults and contempt. This fragile truce allowed me to focus on my mother. We fell into a gentle routine. I would read to her in the afternoons from old novels, her eyes closing as she listened to the rise and fall of my voice. We took slow, shuffling walks in the small backyard, her arm linked through mine, her steps unsteady but determined. In those brief, sun-drenched moments, surrounded by the scent of her rose bushes, I could almost fool myself. I could almost believe that we were a normal family, that the monster under the roof had gone to sleep. A foolish, desperate part of me began to hope. Maybe they've realized how far they went. Maybe things can change. But a good soldier never trusts the quiet. A good soldier knows that the most dangerous enemy is the one you can't see. The storm was not over. It was just gathering strength. The storm broke on a Tuesday afternoon, and it arrived in the form of a summons. Gerald called me into the living room, his face arranged into an expression of theatrical gravity. He was a terrible actor. I saw the calculated performance for what it was, a prelude to an attack. "Sit down, Maisie," he said, gesturing to the armchair opposite him. I remained standing. He sighed, as if burdened by a great weight. "It's about Ethan." He launched into a carefully rehearsed story, apparently a small landscaping business Ethan had tried to start a year ago and abandoned after 2 weeks, had left behind some serious debts. Ethan, being Ethan, had ignored the letters and calls. Now, the people he owed money to were done being patient. "These aren't nice people, Maisie," Gerald said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If he doesn't pay up, they're going to come looking for him. You know how these things go." Then he named a number. It was a staggering amount, a figure so large it made the air in my lungs feel thin. I did a quick, cold calculation. The number he'd just named was nearly half of my entire savings. The money I had painstakingly accumulated from mission after mission, the combat pay I'd earned in the deserts of Afghanistan and the jungles of God knows where. It was my blood money, my ticket to a future, to a life of my own, far away from this house. I stared at him, my face unreadable, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew Ethan. He was a black hole of irresponsibility, a gambler who chased losses with bigger bets. This wasn't a business debt. This was something uglier. And they wanted me to pay for it. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a grenade. Gerald's mask of concern didn't slip, but his eyes hardened. This was the part of the negotiation he'd been waiting for. He leaned back, ready to deploy his heavy artillery, emotional blackmail. "Maisie, Maisie," he sighed, shaking his head with mock sadness. "This is what family is for. We help each other. You've been away, serving your country, making good money. Your brother, he's had a rough time. He's in trouble. Are you really going to turn your back on him? On your own family? He let the words hang in the air before delivering the next volley. Think about your mother. She doesn't know the details, of course, I've protected her from that. But if she found out her son was in danger, that his own sister refused to help him, the stress, the disappointment, it would crush her. Do you really want to put her through that? Do you want to be responsible if her heart gives out? Every word was a precision strike, aimed at the weakest points in my armor, my sense of duty, my loyalty, my love for my mother. He was twisting my own values into weapons to be used against me. He was trying to make my refusal to enable a grown man's destructive behavior into an act of cruel, selfish, matricidal negligence. I could feel the walls of his trap closing in, the air growing thick with guilt and obligation. But I held my ground. The soldier in me took over. I analyzed his tactics, his strategy. I saw the weakness in his position. He was relying on a version of me that no longer existed, the little girl who was desperate for his approval. My money is not for Ethan's mistakes, I said, my voice as steady as my gaze. That's when the performance ended. The mask of the concerned father dissolved, revealing the furious, manipulative tyrant underneath. He slammed his hand down on the coffee table, making a half-empty glass jump and rattle. "Don't you take that high and mighty tone with me," he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "Don't you pretend to be better than us. The day you enlisted, the only reason Ethan didn't go to jail for his gambling debts was because I paid them off. I kept it from your mother to protect her. You got to run away, to play dress-up and live your life, while he had to stay here. You owe him. You owe this family." The lie was so breathtakingly audacious that, for a moment, I was speechless. I knew for a fact it wasn't true. I knew Gerald had never given Ethan a dime he didn't have to. The accusation was absurd, a desperate, pathetic attempt to rewrite history to fit his narrative. It was the final, clarifying piece of evidence. There was no reasoning with him. There was no family to save. There was only an enemy combatant trying to seize my resources for his own gain. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and all the years of fear and intimidation just evaporated. He wasn't a powerful patriarch. He was just a loud, pathetic bully. I let the silence stretch, watching the rage build in his eyes. He was expecting me to cry, to argue, to break. I did none of those things. I met his furious glare with a gaze of absolute glacial calm. And then, I gave him my final answer. No. The word was a quiet death sentence to his plans. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of independence, and the drawing of a line in the sand that I knew I could never undraw. In that one single syllable, I had sealed my fate in this house. The single word "no" hung in the air, a declaration of war. The battle lines had been drawn. In that moment, standing in the suffocating silence of the living room, every ounce of my training kicked in. The situation had escalated beyond negotiation. The objective was no longer to coexist, it was to extract. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked back upstairs, my movements economical and precise. The anger that had been simmering inside me for days had vanished, replaced by something far more effective. A cold, clear, tactical resolve. I pulled my duffel bag from the closet and began to pack, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. T-shirts, socks, fatigues, essentials only. Leave the rest behind. Travel light. Move fast. My first thought was my mother. I couldn't leave her here. I found her in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking small and fragile. "Mom," I said, my voice low and urgent, "we have to go. Now. Pack a bag." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a familiar, paralyzing fear. "Go? Go where, Maisie? What are you talking about?" "Anywhere but here," I insisted. "It's not safe. Please, just pack what you need. We can figure out the rest later." She just shook her head, a gesture of absolute, heartbreaking finality. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, twisting the fabric of her housecoat in her hands. "This is my home, Maisie. It's my home." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I saw the truth. She wasn't just afraid of Gerald. She was a prisoner of the life he had built around her, and she had long ago accepted the terms of her surrender. Trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be saved is a fool's mission. I knew then that I could only save myself. "Okay, Mom," I said softly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I love you." I backed out of the room, closing the door on my final attempt at a rescue. Back in my room, I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. I sent a text to the only ally I had in this city, Robert Hayes. My message was short, stripped down to the bare essentials, just like a field report. "Need to get out of here. Know anywhere safe?" As I was zipping my bag, forcing the last of my gear inside, their voices drifted up from the living room, seeping through the cheap wood of my bedroom door. I froze. My training taught me to gather intelligence at every opportunity. I crept to the door, my breath held tight in my chest, and pressed my ear against it. It was Ethan first, his voice a low, guttural growl, thick with whiskey and rage. "She said no. Can you believe that? The bitch really said no. Who the hell does she think she is?" Then came Gerald's reply. His voice wasn't loud like Ethan's. It was worse. It was calm, measured, and laced with a serpentine poison that made the hair on my arms stand up. "She doesn't see us as family anymore, son," he said, the words smooth and deliberate. "She looks down on us." I was no longer a daughter in that house. I was the enemy. I was an operative listening in on the enemy's plans before an imminent attack. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of survival. Ethan's voice came again, raw with years of festering jealousy and resentment. "Ever since she put on that damn uniform, she's thought she was better than us. She's out there protecting some damn stranger in the street, but she won't help her own brother." There was a pause, a heavy, chilling silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. And then Gerald spoke the words that I quoted in the beginning of my story, the words that would be burned into my memory forever. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a venomous, intimate whisper meant only for his son. "She doesn't respect us, son. Teach her a lesson." The command was so simple, so devoid of emotion, it was like he was ordering a pizza. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just angry talk anymore. This was a directive, a kill order. Another beat of silence, then Ethan's reply, and the sound of it made me want to vomit. His voice was no longer angry. It was filled with a sick, twisted glee, the sound of a predator finally being let off its leash. "I understand, Dad," he said, his tone almost cheerful. "A lesson she'll never forget." My heart stopped. My training, my instincts, every fiber of my being screamed one word: danger. This was a direct, credible threat. The mission parameters had changed. This was no longer an extraction. It was an escape. If you have ever had that cold, sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach, that primal instinct telling you that you are in real danger, hit that like button and comment, "Trust your gut," below. Because sometimes it's the only thing that can save you. I had to move. Right now, I needed to get to my car and drive. But my mind raced through my supplies. I had nothing. No water, no food for the road. The nearest 24/7 convenience store was just a few blocks away. A quick stop just to grab the essentials, and then I'd be gone. My phone buzzed in my hand, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. It was a reply from Robert. "Come to my place, now." The doors unlocked. Relief washed over me, a tiny pinprick of light in an ocean of terror. I had a destination. I had a safe house. I took a deep, steadying breath, the way I did before breaching a door. I slung my duffel bag over my shoulder, opened my bedroom door, and stepped into the hallway. I moved with a practiced silence, my steps light on the creaking floorboards. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I had to walk past the living room to get to the front door. I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't look at them, but I could feel the weight of their gaze, the sheer malevolence pouring out of them. They were completely silent. The TV was off. They were just sitting there in the dim light, watching me. It wasn't the look of anger anymore. It was something far, far worse. It was the calm, patient, deeply satisfied look of a pair of predators who had just watched their prey walk, knowingly and willingly, straight into the jaws of their trap. The automatic doors of the 24/7 convenience store slid open with a soft hiss, and a blast of frigid, recycled air hit my face. The transition from the humid Charleston night to the sterile, fluorescent-lit interior was jarring. The place was unnaturally bright, the aisles of candy and chips glowing under the relentless hum of the overhead lights. My plan was simple: grab a bottle of water, a couple of energy bars, and get to Robert's house. A tactical resupply before moving to the safe zone. My senses were on high alert, every sound magnified. The clink of a glass bottle, the crinkle of a chip bag, the low murmur of the cashier talking on the phone. As I moved toward the refrigerated section, a familiar figure near the checkout counter caught my eye. It was Robert Hayes, maneuvering his wheelchair with some difficulty around a promotional display. He saw me at the same moment, and a look of genuine relief washed over his tired features. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a warm, welcome sound in the cold store. "Glad to see a friendly face." That brief, unexpected moment of camaraderie, of finding an ally in the middle of a war zone, was a dangerous thing. It made me drop my guard for just a fraction of a second, and a fraction of a second is all the enemy ever needs. The automatic doors hissed open again. My head snapped toward the sound, and my blood ran cold. Ethan stumbled in, his movements clumsy with alcohol. Flanking him were two of his grimy friends, the kind of guys who orbit losers, hoping to catch some of the drama. The trap I thought I had evaded at the house had just been reset. Ethan's bloodshot eyes scanned the store and locked onto us. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of mirth, it was the predatory grin of a hyena that has cornered its prey. He and his friends began to stalk toward us, their heavy boots loud on the cheap linoleum floor. Well, look what we have here," Ethan slurred, his voice dripping with malice. He gestured drunkenly between me and Robert. The happy couple, the heroes. He got closer, the sour smell of cheap liquor rolling off him in waves. He leaned in toward me. "Did you run away from home to be with this old cripple, you backstabbing bitch?" Robert tried to de-escalate. "Easy now, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's all just take a breath." Ethan whipped his head toward him, his face contorted with rage. "You shut your mouth, you washed-up old man," he spat. He turned back to me, poking a finger hard into my chest, right on my sternum. "You picked a side, now you get what's coming to you." Every instinct screamed at me to neutralize the threat. My training provided a dozen ways to put him on the floor in under 5 seconds. But I wasn't in a war zone. I was in a convenience store in Charleston, South Carolina. And this was my stepbrother. So I did the one thing my training didn't account for. I hesitated. I took a step back, instinctively moving to put myself more fully between Ethan and Robert. I knew words were useless now. The lesson was about to begin. It happened in a flash. Ethan's hand went to his belt, and suddenly there was a glint of metal under the fluorescent lights. A hunting knife. My body moved on pure instinct. My primary mission objective wasn't to fight. It was to protect. The first stab. He lunged, aiming for my stomach. My left arm came up in a block, the blade slicing through my jacket and across my forearm. A sharp, searing line of fire. The second stab. I twisted my body, turning my side to him to keep my vital organs away from the blade while shielding Robert completely. The knife sank into my side, just above my hip. A deep, sickening pain that took my breath away. Ethan's two friends, emboldened, swarmed in. One of them threw a clumsy punch that connected with my jaw, snapping my head back. The store seemed to tilt on its axis. In that moment of disorientation, Ethan struck again. The third and fourth stabs. 2 quick, brutal thrusts into my back and shoulder. I felt the impacts more than the cuts, like being punched with a fistful of sharp rocks. I heard Robert yelling, his voice cracking with panic and horror. The store, which had been filled with small noises just moments before, fell into a dead, ringing silence. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the thud of bodies colliding. I saw the other customers, frozen in the aisles, their faces pale masks of shock. A few phones came up, small dark rectangles capturing the scene. "Call 911, I screamed, my voice raw. The fifth, sixth, and seventh stabs. He was in a frenzy now, a wild animal, just stabbing at anything he could reach. I felt the blade tear into my thigh, my other arm, my upper chest. Blood was everywhere. It was warm and slick, soaking through my clothes, making the floor slippery beneath my boots. My vision started to tunnel, the bright lights of the store blurring at the edges. But I didn't fall. I braced myself, my feet planted, my body a living shield. I would not let him get to the man behind me. The eighth and final stab. He put all his weight behind this one. The blade plunged deep into my abdomen. It wasn't a sharp pain this time. It was a deep, catastrophic tearing, a white-hot agony that seemed to obliterate everything else. The strength went out of my legs. The sight of the blood, so much of it, finally seemed to penetrate Ethan's drunken haze. His eyes widened in panic. He looked at the knife in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. He and his friend scrambled backward, turned, and bolted out the door, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. My knees buckled. The world tilted, this time for good. I crumpled to the floor, the cold of the linoleum a shock against my skin. Robert was there instantly, his hands pressing down on my wounds, trying desperately to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, soldier, stay with me," his voice pleaded, sounding distant and distorted, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "Don't you give up!" I tried to focus on his face, but it was just a blur. My body felt strangely light, detached. From far away, I could hear the faint, rising wail of a siren. It grew louder, then softer, fading in and out. The fluorescent lights above me dimmed, shrinking into pinpricks of light against a vast, encroaching darkness. Darkness. Then fragments of light and sound, swimming in and out of focus like a badly tuned radio. I was floating in a cold, gray space, untethered from my own body. There were beeps, a rhythmic, insistent pulse that was the only anchor in the void. Voices, sharp and urgent, cut through the fog. Losing too much blood. Pressures dropping. Hearts failing. Clear. A violent electric jolt ripped through me, arching my back off a surface I couldn't feel. For a single, lucid moment, the gray fog cleared, and I saw them. The faces of my fallen brothers in arms, the ones who didn't make it home. They were standing in the mist, not sad, just waiting, their expressions calm. They were waiting for me. I felt a sense of peace, a readiness to join their ranks. But then another voice broke through, fierce and desperate, pulling me back from the edge. It was Robert's voice, echoing from the cold floor of the convenience store. "Stay with me, soldier." The rhythmic beeping of the machine, which had flatlined into a solid tone, suddenly faltered. And then began its steady pulse once more. I had survived. But my war was far from over. The next time I woke, the world was painfully real. The harsh, sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nostrils. A tangle of tubes snaked into my arms, and the steady rhythmic puffing of a ventilator was the only sound in the quiet room. An ICU. I'd been in enough field hospitals to recognize it. My first visitor was not a doctor or a nurse, it was Gerald. He stood by my bedside, his arms crossed, his face a cold, unreadable mask. There was no worry in his eyes, no flicker of concern. Only a cold, hard assessment, like a general surveying a captured enemy. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, and only a dry croak came out. "The police have been here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the bandages and tubes that held my body together. He just delivered his report. "I told them what happened, how you started the fight, how you went after Ethan, and he had to defend himself." The words didn't register at first. I was still weak, my mind clouded by a fog of painkillers. "Your mother confirmed it," he added, the final brutal twist of the knife. My eyes darted to the doorway. My mother, Martha, was standing there, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling. She was wringing her hands, unable to look at me, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. Her silence was a confession. Her tears were not for me, they were for her own cowardice. The ultimate betrayal, the most monstrous lie, had been told and validated. It was a wound deeper and more septic than any of the 8 stab wounds I was recovering from. In that moment, helpless in my hospital bed, I felt a despair so absolute that I wished the doctors had let me go. Justice, it seemed, had died on the operating table. 2 days passed in a blur of pain, medication, and the suffocating presence of my mother's silent guilt. Then, a new visitor appeared. He introduced himself as Detective Miller, a tired-looking, middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. He had the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of the worst of humanity, but there was a kindness in them too. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Sergeant Wright," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you're in a lot of pain. I just need to hear your side of the story, whenever you're ready." Slowly, painfully, I told him everything. From the moment I'd arrived home to the final, agonizing stab in the convenience store. He listened patiently, never interrupting, his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, my throat was dry, and my body was shaking with exhaustion. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just nodded slowly. Then, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet. He placed it on the rolling table over my bed and pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The image was grainy, shot from a high angle, the colors washed out under the fluorescent lights. It was the security camera footage from the store. I watched, mesmerized, as the scene unfolded exactly as I remembered it. Ethan's aggressive approach, my instinctive move to shield Robert, the glint of the knife, and then the brutal, relentless attack. It was all there, every stab, every moment of my defiance, every second of his savagery. "We also got cell phone videos from 3 different witnesses," Detective Miller said quietly, as if narrating the scene. "Their stories line up perfectly with what we're seeing here." I stared at the screen, at the undeniable, objective truth of what had happened. The tears that had been frozen inside me for 2 days finally began to thaw. They streamed down my face, hot and silent. But for the first time, they were not tears of pain or despair. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. I wasn't crazy, I hadn't imagined it. The truth had a witness. Detective Miller let the video play out. "Ethan Mitchell is in the wind," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "He ran. But with this," he said, tapping the screen, "he won't be running for long. We've issued a statewide APB for his arrest." He reached into his bag again and placed a small plastic CD case on the table. "This is a copy for your records," he said. He stood up, preparing to leave, but then paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing." He turned back to look at me, his expression all business. "We notified your unit, Sergeant. It's procedure." That last sentence, delivered as a simple, bureaucratic formality, was the one that changed everything. It was a single, procedural domino that, in falling, would trigger a chain reaction they could never have anticipated. With that one sentence, Gerald and Ethan's private little war against me was about to go public. They didn't know it yet, but they had just awakened the army I belonged to. The news that Ethan had been apprehended came from Detective Miller via a short, professional phone call. They'd caught him trying to cross the state line into Georgia. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so strong it left me lightheaded. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the worst was over, that the system would now run its course. That relief lasted for exactly 12 hours. The next call informed me that Ethan was out. Gerald had posted bail. Just like that, with a signature and a check, my attacker was free to walk the streets. The fragile sense of safety I'd begun to feel shattered. A cold, bitter rage filled the void, followed by a crushing sense of helplessness. Money. It seemed to be the one weapon against which I had no defense. Lying there in my hospital bed, tethered to machines, I had never felt smaller or more alone. The justice system, the one I'd been raised to believe in, had failed me. But I was wrong. The system had another, older branch, one that operated on a different code of ethics. The next morning, the entire atmosphere of my hospital floor changed. It started when two soldiers in immaculate Army service uniforms appeared outside my door. They didn't enter, they simply took up positions on either side of the doorway, standing at a relaxed parade rest. They were a silent, formidable presence that made nurses and doctors alike alter their paths, their voices dropping to respectful whispers. I was no longer just a patient. I was under guard. A few minutes later, a tall, powerfully built man with a ramrod straight posture and the unmistakable aura of command stepped into my room. On the collar of his uniform, 3 silver stars glittered under the harsh hospital lights. Lieutenant General Miller, from the United States Special Operations Command, so calm. He wasn't a bureaucrat or a politician, he was a warrior. And he had come not as an official, but as my commanding officer. He pulled the visitor's chair close to my bed and sat down, his movements economical and precise. His presence filled the small room. But it wasn't intimidating, it was reassuring. "Sergeant Wright," he said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that held a quiet authority. He looked directly at me, his gaze steady and clear. "We've seen the video." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You acted in accordance with the highest traditions of a Green Beret. You protected an innocent, even when off-duty, at great personal risk. You did us proud." Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and sudden. To hear those words from this man was a validation so profound it almost hurt. It was the recognition I had craved from my own family, a recognition they had twisted into a joke. General Miller continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "An attack on one of our soldiers is an attack on all of us. Your stepfather's family may have money, Sergeant, but we have something else. We have honor." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "From this moment forward, you are not alone in this fight. The United States Army is standing with you." Before he left, he reached into his pocket and placed a heavy, ornate coin on my bedside table. It was his challenge coin, the SOCOM insignia embossed on the burnished metal. In our world, receiving a commander's coin is a sign of profound respect, a tangible symbol that you are part of the tribe, part of a family bound not by blood, but by a shared oath and sacrifice. I picked it up, the cool, solid weight of it a comfort in my palm. It was a promise, it was a shield. The general's visit was a quiet earthquake, and the aftershock spread with astonishing speed. News of what happened to a Green Beret on American soil at the hands of her own family, and the subsequent visit from a 3-star general rippled through the military and veteran communities like wildfire. The story was no longer about a domestic dispute, it was about honor. A few days later, I was strong enough to sit up in the chair by the window. The nurse had just left when I noticed a gathering on the hospital lawn below. At first, it was just a few people, then a few more. Within an hour, there were at least 50 of them. They were veterans. I saw the leather jackets of the Marines, the windbreakers of the Navy, the field jackets of the Army, and the blue of the Air Force. Robert Hayes was there, front and center in his wheelchair, his Marine Corps cap held proudly in his lap. They weren't protesting. They weren't holding signs or shouting slogans. They were just standing. A silent, disciplined, unmovable formation. An army of honor, standing a quiet vigil for one of their own. They stood there for hours, a silent, powerful testament to a code that Gerald and Ethan could never comprehend. You do not leave your wounded behind. Reporters started to arrive, their cameras and microphones held at a respectful distance. The story was officially out. It was on the local news, then the national blogs. The quiet giant of the American military community had been awakened. Gerald and Ethan had wanted to teach me a lesson, to put me in my place and remind me that I was nothing. But in their arrogant, petty cruelty, they had forgotten one crucial detail. They may have thought they were fighting one lone, broken soldier. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with the entire United States Armed Forces. The day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed to the rafters, a silent, tense sea of opposing forces. On one side, my side, the gallery was a solid wall of dress uniforms and proud, stoic faces. Active duty soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder with veterans, their presence a quiet, unshakable testament to the code we all shared. Robert Hayes was in the front row, wearing his own Marine Corps dress blues, his back as straight as his wheelchair would allow. On the other side sat a sparse collection of Gerald and Ethan's acquaintances, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Ethan and Gerald sat at the defendant's table, looking small and pathetic under the weight of the state's prosecution. The trial had been swift. The prosecution's case was simple and devastatingly effective. When the lead prosecutor played the security camera footage on the large screens, a collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The grainy, silent video was more powerful than any testimony. It showed the unvarnished truth, the provocation, my defense of Robert, and the brutal, relentless violence that followed. The jury was captivated, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. But the final, fatal blow to their defense came from the most unexpected of sources: my mother. When the prosecutor called Martha Wright to the stand, she looked like a ghost, her face pale and her hands trembling. Gerald shot her a look of pure venom, a silent threat across the courtroom. But for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. Her testimony began as a barely audible whisper, but as the prosecutor gently guided her, her voice grew stronger. She recounted the events of that night, her words painting a damning picture of Gerald's manipulation and Ethan's seething rage. The prosecutor asked the final question. "Mrs. Wright, did you hear your husband, Gerald, say anything to your son, Ethan, before your daughter left the house that night?" My mother took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked past Gerald, past Ethan, and for the first time in years, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were filled with a universe of pain and regret. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking as a sob broke through. He told him to teach her a lesson." The words hung in the air, an admission of guilt that sealed their fate. She broke down completely then, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs of a woman who had finally chosen truth over fear. The jury was out for less than an hour. The foreman, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes, handed the verdict to the bailiff. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. The foreman cleared her throat and read the verdict. For Ethan Mitchell, on the charge of attempted murder, guilty. For Gerald, on the charges of conspiracy and incitement to violence, guilty. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. The sound of the judge's gavel striking the wood was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the end. It was the sound of justice. Before they were sentenced, I was given the opportunity to read my victim impact statement. I walked to the podium, my steps steady, my gaze fixed. I didn't look at them. I didn't waste a single glance on the two men who had tried to destroy me. Instead, I looked at Robert Hayes. I looked at the soldiers and veterans who had filled the courtroom for me every single day. I looked at my real family. "The oath a soldier takes is to support and defend," I began, my voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. "That oath doesn't come with an expiration date. It doesn't apply only on a foreign battlefield. It applies in a convenience store. It applies on a quiet city street. It applies in your own home." I finally allowed my eyes to drift over to them, not with hatred, but with a cold, final pity. "You tried to take my life," I said. "You failed. You tried to take my honor. You failed. The only thing you ever managed to take from me was my silence." As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, Ethan to serve 15 years, Gerald to serve 5, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a profound, limitless sense of peace. The war was finally over. My recovery, both physical and psychological, was the hardest mission I've ever undertaken. But this time, I wasn't alone. The Army provided the best therapists, specialists who understood the unique intersection of combat trauma and personal trauma. Robert Hayes became my closest friend, my confidant. We would meet for coffee, attend veteran support group meetings together, and talk for hours. Two old soldiers healing from different wars. It was in one of my therapy sessions that I had a breakthrough. I was talking about the anger, the feeling of being at war in my own home, when a memory surfaced. My grandmother, a deeply religious woman, used to read the Bible to me. A specific verse came to mind, clear as day. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And in that moment, I understood. My actions in the convenience store, in the courtroom, in my own life, they weren't about making war. They were about making peace. You don't create peace by being passive. You create it by standing up to violence, by shielding the innocent, by stopping the chaos. That realization settled something deep in my soul. It gave me a new mission. A year later, the physical scars remained, a faint, silvery map of that night's violence, but the internal wounds had begun to heal. I knew I couldn't go back to the battlefield. My fight was here now. Robert and I pooled our resources and our shared sense of purpose and started a nonprofit organization. We called it the Shield Project. Our mission is to provide free support, legal aid, and self-defense training to victims of domestic violence, with a special focus on the unique challenges within military families. My story has a postscript, written not by me, but by the city of Charleston. On the side of the building next to that convenience store, a local artist painted a mural. It's a striking, powerful image of a female soldier in uniform, standing with her arms outstretched, shielding an older man in a wheelchair from the shadows. It has become a landmark, a symbol of hope and defiance. Sometimes I drive by and look at it. I see the woman I was and the woman I have become. My story, the one that began with so much pain and betrayal, is over. But my legacy, our legacy, is just getting started. Thank you for listening to my story. Sharing this wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My battle ended in a courtroom and found its purpose in the Shield Project. But I know that many of you might be fighting your own, quieter wars every day. This channel is a place for stories like mine, stories of survival, resilience, and finding the strength to stand up when you've been knocked down. If you believe in the power of these stories and want to be part of a community that understands, please like this video and subscribe. Remember, your voice is your weapon and your honor is your shield. Never let anyone take them from you.